Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Environmental School Course 1 for the National Garden Clubs. My name is Dr. Paul Bilinski, and I am recording this talk in case folks want to be able to revisit the topics at hand or are unable to attend the session in person. I always like to include a picture of myself and our new young daughter, Helena. As today, I'm going to be talking about two topics, ecology and plant biodiversity, two topics that are very near and dear to my heart and important for her future. So a little bit of my background so that way y'all understand where my training comes in and what biases I may carry into this presentation today. First, I got my bachelor's and master's in ecology from the University of California in San Diego. While I was born in the Midwest, I did most of my growing up in California. And then I continued on in California for my doctorate in plant biology, specifically plant evolutionary biology at UC Davis, where I studied adaptation and evolution in maize or corn. So, a very important food crop. So, with that background, let's hopefully get excited and interested in to discuss the things that we're going to explore as have been requested by the National Garden Clubs as to what content is important ecologically for this course. The first topic is, of course, ecology. Now, ecology is the study of relationships between living things and their physical environment. We as scientists can break down that relationship into the biotic or living thing component and the abiotic, the non-living thing component. When we talk about the biotic components, we're oftentimes looking at things from a perspective of a food chain. Now, this food chain always will begin with a primary producer. And you'll notice I have, throughout the lecture, a lot of the vocabulary terms as highlighted by the National Garden Clubs written in green throughout the lecture. And I'll be adding my own notes throughout it to hopefully clarify things in blue. Now, as I outline with all of my classes in person, I would recommend taking notes not only on the things that are written on the screen, those are really the major bullet points, but also listening more so to the words that I write. Words that I speak. I can speak much faster than I can write, and my handwriting hopefully is sufficiently legible, but you should ideally be keeping track of the major topic areas, and the recording will help you pause and go back in case I do speak quickly, which I know I have a tendency to do. So back to our vocabulary. When we're studying ecology, and we're studying the biotic component of the environment, we're looking at a food chain that will always begin with a primary producer. Those primary producers are the photosynthetic things. Because photosynthesis is the process by which our planet converts sunlight energy into chemical energy that we can store for later. Those primary producers, better known to us as either algae or plants, two major categories of our primary producers, are then consumed in this food chain via herbivores. Herbivores are animals that specialize in consuming primary producers or plants because in order to consume primary producers, they have to have particular digestive systems or enzymatic processes that help them obtain energy from those carbon-to-carbon bonds that are present in plants. Now, once an herbivore consumes a primary producer, a carnivore can then access that energy that's been stored from the primary producer into the herbivore, and now again into the carnivore. Carnivores specialize on eating meat, so they will eat simply their trophic level or the chain just before them. Trophic levels refer to each of the links in a food chain. And now those carnivores are then recycled through this process via decomposers. So we can then, again, make available those resources that were stored in the carnivore back to our primary producers via decomposers. So looking at this in a more realistic chain and my cartoonish illustrations, you'll notice that there's a mix of cartoonish illustrations as well as images directly taken from sources. You can find the works cited and the sources from which I've taken images from attached to this talk in the comments. Our primary producers, a good example of this would be something like our grasses. Grasses will perform photosynthesis and store some of that energy as sugar in the leaves, and then use a lot of that energy to grow the grass components that are calorically empty to us. And in this way, the food chains make it so that way they look much like a food pyramid, wherein the amount of energy available to our primary producers is much more than to other links in the food chain, meaning that in terms of biomass, you will have the most of our primary producers, and they will pass along something like 10% of the total amount of energy that they generate to our next trophic level, which in this case, on our pastures, will be our tactfully illustrated horse. So these herbivores that specialize on eating our primary producers will get, in total, about 10% of the energy that the grass has produced. And then they, in turn, can pass along 10% of their energy, albeit unwillingly, just like the primary producers did it unwillingly, to our carnivore. In this case, the great black panther of the steppe, a completely artificial animal here, but hopefully illustrating that we have organisms that specialize on eating primary producers, getting 10% of our energy from them, and then another 10% passing on to our carnivores. Now they, again, are able to be recycled after their death via a couple of different organisms, most specifically fungi and bacteria that are classified as our decomposers. They will make available those resources in the dirt, in the soil, again, for our primary producers. And in this way, we see the cycling, the nutrient cycling that we'll talk about a little bit more specifically in a second, that characterizes our ecosystems. There's one other important component of these food chains, and those are pathogens. Now, we as a society have become very acutely aware of pathogens over the last 2 years, living in the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, pathogens are microorganisms that are able to attack either primary producers, herbivores, carnivores, or even decomposers, and speed along their recycling through the food chain by killing them and then making them available to the decomposers earlier. So again, we have all these things, all these links in the food chain that characterize our biotic component to our study of ecology. When we talk about our abiotic component, we're speaking specifically about the physical characteristics of an ecosystem. Things like the air, the water and its availability, the soil and its nutrient content, and the temperature of the area. This helps us understand how ecology varies across different areas of the planet. Now, in order to study these biotic and abiotic systems, we're going to classify them based on similarity in order to group them into what we call ecosystems. To study these ecosystems, we try to use a couple of terms that, again, are referenced in the suggested vocabulary for this course, some things that really make ecosystems stand out from one another and allow us to study them as individual units. The first, of course, has to do with primary producers. Again, looking at primary productivity. Now, the primary productivity of an ecosystem is going to be the total amount of sugar, the total amount of energy available to that ecosystem based on how much is produced by the primary producers. So a fairly circular term here, fairly self-evident, but it's very important to understand that these primary producers and the primary productivity ultimately measures the amount of photosynthesis, the amount of energy stored in carbon-to-carbon bonds, because ultimately carbon-to-carbon bonds are chemical batteries for sunlight energy. It's kind of weird to think about, but yeah, that's ultimately what sugar is. It's a battery for storing sunlight's energy, rather than using that sunlight's energy at the moment to create heat, as we love to do in the summertime. These plants are storing it so that way they can use it to grow at different points of the day at perhaps tissues that are not performing photosynthesis. This primary productivity then can go through the process of cellular respiration in our herbivores and carnivores, and this is how we ultimately release the energy of our carbon-to-carbon bonds. Now, this process of cycling from photosynthesis to cellular respiration and cellular respiration back to photosynthesis is a good example of our nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling is how elements go from one state to another. Carbon in our environment begins as inorganic carbon dioxide, then through the process of photosynthesis gets converted into sugar, and then in the process of cellular respiration will get converted back into carbon dioxide. Now, it does not just go directly from CO2 to sugar and sugar back to CO2, because that would mean that our entire cycle is simply captured within a single plant. Plants do perform both photosynthesis and cellular respiration, but again, we have to study how much of that sugar goes into our herbivores, and then into our carnivores, and then into our decomposers. This then completes our entire nutrient cycle for the carbon cycle. So when we look at a food chain, fundamentally we are looking at part of our carbon cycle. Now I'm going to go ahead and copy this image because, in terms of speaking about one of our later topics, when we talk about effects on climate and fossil fuels, we need to understand why fossil fuels are a non-renewable resource and where they figure into this overall nutrient cycling for carbon. Well, at one point in Earth's history, I'll clean up a little bit of this. At one point in Earth's history, these plants, as they would die, they would not go either directly into decomposition and then back to plant material or up the food chain. Instead, they would die and not rot. The decomposers were not present. Think about how weird that is. Things that could break down cell walls, things that could break down tree wood, were not yet evolved on our planet. So when these trees died, rather than being decomposed, they went off into a reserve of fossil fuels. And in this way, carbon that was in our atmosphere got stored away underground in many of its different forms, whether that be as oil or as charcoal, or even more recently can be stored temporarily as wood. These carbon-to-carbon bonds are carbon molecules that are not present in our atmosphere and an important part of this carbon cycle. Another cycle that I think it's important to understand when discussing ecology is the nitrogen cycle. Now, nitrogen is an incredibly important building block of our organic molecules. Most importantly, nitrogen is found in both proteins and nucleic acids at high abundance. Proteins are the molecular building blocks of things that perform your metabolism, super important, keep you alive. And nucleic acids are the molecular building blocks of your DNA and RNAs, the things that store the information that give you the blueprint to make your proteins that again keep you alive. So nitrogen is incredibly important in what makes us living things on planet Earth. However, the vast majority of the nitrogen on planet Earth is held in a storage tank that's inaccessible to organic things. Nitrogen, as N2, is in our air at an abundance of 78%. That means that 78% of the air that you breathe is nitrogen. But because it's in the air, it's in a form that cannot be accessed by you. I mean, it'd be awesome if you didn't need to eat sources of nitrogen like meat or legumes, but instead could breathe it in, but our bodies can't do anything with it. Instead, in order to get that nitrogen from the air, there are certain bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria that are able to grab that nitrogen from the air and convert it into forms that are usable to us. Things like ammonia or urea, or as individual building blocks of proteins. But here's the catch about nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They need to exist in environments without oxygen. And therefore, they need to form a symbiotic relationship. Again, one of the vocabulary terms for the class. A symbiotic relationship, meaning that two different species are working together to benefit each other. Now, nitrogen-fixing bacteria can't exist where oxygen is, and plants can't exist without nitrogen. So therefore, there are certain species of plants that have developed little homes or nodules. Those of you who perhaps like to garden and produce legumes or beans may have noticed when digging up some of these bean plants that they have little nodes or bumps on their roots. Those little bumps on their roots are little homes for these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, where the plant will actually pull out all of the oxygen from that nodule. It's oxygen depleted, which is pretty crazy. Little bumps that don't have oxygen. They do so with a certain protein that you may be familiar with. It's called heme. It's very similar to the heme that you and I use to grab oxygen from the air in our blood. But in this case, the plant's using it to pull out the oxygen from the nodule to create these nitrogen-fixing bacteria homes. And then those nitrogen-fixing bacteria provide nitrogen to the plant as a thanks for creating them a home. Those plants are then consumed by herbivores and carnivores, and then decomposed again. And in that decomposition process, or as a carnivore myself, I recycle nitrogen back into a form that can be unusable through my urine. So again, via multiple different steps, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria can either be stored and recycled in organic nitrogen or end up in the air. So these are two major cycles, and a vocab term that allows us to understand that these elements transfer from forms of inorganic to organic and back again, and how much of that is bioavailable to the organisms that live in an ecosystem. A lot of nutrient cycling and a lot of primary productivity will result in a larger biodiversity of things. But biodiversity is not only predicted by how much primary productivity and nutrient cycling, but the amount of environmental or ecological niches present in that ecosystem. So what exactly is an ecological niche? Well, an ecological niche is a set of biotic and abiotic conditions in which a species is able to persist and maintain its population size. And niche construction, or the ability of a species to carve out new ways for them to persist and maintain stable population sizes, is oftentimes a function of time in an ecosystem. Older ecosystems have more niches carved out and therefore can support more species. And therefore, it's really important to understand how much sugar is available, how and how fast nutrients cycle through an ecosystem, and how long that ecosystem has been around, and how it's partitioned into different pies in order to understand the total amount of biodiversity present in that ecosystem. Now, the last vocab term that's going to tie into our overall understanding of ecosystems has to do with that niche, because each ecosystem for each species will have a carrying capacity, or the total number of individuals of a species that can be supported based on these other factors, based on the primary productivity, nutrient cycling, and niche construction. The carrying capacity measures how many individuals of a species can be supported and can actually change through time. As biotic and abiotic conditions change, perhaps as droughts strike, you're going to see a reduction in carrying capacity. As temperatures drop, you may also see reductions or perhaps increases in carrying capacity of different species. So the interactions between these different terms will overall give us a better understanding of what forces are shaping our ecosystems. As a good example of understanding our changes in carrying capacity, you need not look further than humans and how well we've done in changing the total number of humans that can exist on this planet. Through processes like the agricultural revolution, 10,000 or so years ago, or more recently the green revolution in the last 100 years, we've enabled ourselves to produce much more food in our environment, and therefore allowed human population sizes and the carrying capacity of our planet for humans to increase. So that gives us a good understanding of some of the vocabulary necessary and highlighted in the course. I want to take a little bit of a tangent here to show y'all something from my ecology teachings at West Shore as to how we classify our different ecosystems. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important to understand, broadly speaking, what forces are driving our major ecosystem differences. And of course, they're going to be abiotic forces like water availability and temperature. This is a little pyramid for our terrestrial ecosystems, so land-based ecosystems. I'll be avoiding any discussion of aquatic ecosystems for now. But we can describe our ecosystems on this planet based on how much water availability they have and how temperatures vary, and year-long average temperatures, in order to understand why some of the rainforests along the equator, whether they be in South America or Africa or Southeast Asia, are similar, why some of the savannas are similar, and so on and so forth for our different ecosystems. Regions that are high in water and high in temperature are more likely to produce rainforests. Regions that are low in water but high in temperature are more likely to produce desert-like ecosystems. Savannas have an intermediate amount of water that can support tree species. You oftentimes find tree species in places where water availability is high. This is true both in the modern era as well as when we look in the past. So where we find tree fossils, we know that those areas would have had high water availability, which is kind of cool to think about ecology not only in a modern geographical perspective, but in a perspective looking backwards in time. Areas that have changes in temperature, so a cold season and a hot season, are more likely to produce temperate forests like those that we see here in West Michigan. Sure do love our fall colors, and looking forward to seeing all the changes that we'll have around the time of this class. When water availability gets a little bit lower, you may encounter some of the temperate grasslands, some of the prairies that we would see out in Iowa that make for excellent farmland. And then when temperatures begin to truly plummet, you'll see taigas, where water availability is still, where temperatures and water availability are still sufficient. And then when temperatures get sufficiently low, where permafrost exists, you'll see a lack of tree species and the tundra. And in places where water availability is during off seasons, where it rains during the winter and it's sunny during the summer, you'll find scrublands, environments that I grew up in California. I always thought it rained in the wintertime. And then move into the Midwest, yeah, it's a little bit different out here. So this gives us a real quick overview of the ecosystems that we'll find terrestrially and how these abiotic factors go towards establishing these broad swaths of ecosystems. And within each of those ecosystems, we can study the biotic components, how tree species in the rainforest of South America differ from tree species in the rainforest of Africa, and how that affects the overall food chains. When we're studying those biotic components of our biosphere, we are going to classify them based on a biological hierarchy in order to understand the relationships between them. This allows us to compare ecosystems across the planet. So let's take a quick look at the breakdown of biological hierarchy in order to understand what each of its components are. Biospheres, or our planet, can be broken down into our different ecosystems that we just discussed. Those ecosystems can be broken down into communities. Communities are one of the terms that are emphasized in this course. So it's important to understand that a community is a way to understand the relationships between different species in an ecosystem. So we understand how food traffics from some of our primary producers to our herbivores to perhaps some of our carnivores and decomposers, birds of prey or vultures decomposing some of these organisms. The difference between our ecosystem and our community is that our community is specifically looking at the biotic components. So we've abandoned our abiotic components that were so critical in defining our ecosystems. We then can drill down in our community to understand a single population of a single species. Those populations can be broken down into individual organisms. Those organisms can be further studied based on their organ systems, like a circulatory system. That circulatory system can then be broken down into the organs that comprise it, like a heart, not at all illustrated accurately. But a heart will then be broken down and can be described based on the different tissues present. Here we have my artistic rendering of muscle tissue, characterized by its striations and multiple nuclei per cell. Yeah, kind of weird to think about. Multiple nuclei per cell in muscle tissue, not very standard. Not the image that you see in every single biology textbook when you start out a cell biology class. But those tissues then can be broken down into individual cells, and it's important to note here that cells are the fundamental building block of living things. Nothing smaller than a cell is alive, because to be alive you need to be able to meet certain conditions, like use and obtain energy, be able to reproduce, respond to stimuli. And cells are the smallest building block that can perform this. Cells can collaborate to form tissues, tissues can collaborate to form organs, organs can collaborate to form organ systems, ultimately organisms, and then those organisms can go on to form populations. But fundamentally, the smallest building block always goes back to our cells. Now, when we go past cells, in terms of what builds cells, we find our non-living components, our molecules that are combinations of individual atoms, atoms like carbon. Now, when you think of atoms, you hopefully think of our periodic table. Very important to understand the atoms that build up life and how those atoms combine in our biological macromolecules. Those biological macromolecules are of 4 different groups. Our proteins, illustrated in their simple chemical formula here. Nucleic acids, things that we've already discussed, are DNAs and RNAs. Our carbohydrates, that are batteries that store energy from sunlight. And then our lipids, fats, that provide barriers between different sacs of water. It is all the lipids that are part of my skin and my cell membranes that prevent water from leaking out into the environment, and for which I am very thankful for. We can see that these molecules are formed via chemical bonds between nitrogens and carbons. So again, revisiting that topic, that nitrogen cycles through living things, oftentimes in the form of proteins as well as nucleic acids. So that gives us an idea of the biological hierarchy of things, with ecology focusing on the study of ecosystems, communities, and populations. Because ultimately, ecology is looking at species to understand what produces more biodiversity, what maintains biodiversity, and ultimately what drives biodiversity on our planet, and how we can study that biodiversity in order to either simply appreciate and conserve nature, or potentially find new medical compounds that can be of service to maintaining human health. A species is defined through a number of different ways. The most common is the biological species concept, meaning that an organism that's able to procreate with another species, with another individual, meaning that they're able to make fertile offspring. By this definition, humans, Homo sapiens, can mate with one another. Homo is our genus, sapiens is our specific species, but we also have members of our family. And this breakdown of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species are our taxonomic system derived by Linnaeus a couple hundred years ago in order to help us understand the relationships between organisms. For the purposes of this class, when we think about organisms, we're oftentimes going to ignore the domain. Multicellular things, so big organisms that you and I can see with our naked eye, are always eukaryotes. We sometimes think about their kingdom. This would be whether they are plants or animals. And we're oftentimes able to group things based on phyla. Is it a fern plant? Is it a insect animal? Or is it a vertebrate animal? Those things break down into different phyla. Classes and orders are a little bit more difficult for us to gather information from, but families matter a lot. So whenever I teach my local flora class in the summer, we really emphasize the family taxonomic stratification, because you can see a lot of similarities in species within the same families. For example, another organism within our family, and as well as our same genus, would be Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthals. They are similar to us, Homo sapiens, and we could even produce offspring with them, thereby really blurring the line of what truly is a biological species, but we had enough differences anatomically, behaviorally, and genetically that Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis are two different species that were able to occasionally mate. And all of us carry something like 1 to 3% of Neanderthal DNA within us, with some folks carrying perhaps even more. Okay, so hopefully that quick overview gives you an idea of how we understand the classifications that go into our ecosystems and the biotic components, the life that exists therein. However, the biosphere is only one of several spheres that defines the ecology of our planet, the ecology of our geosphere. And here's perhaps one place where I have a disagreement with some of the vocabulary used in your textbook. The geosphere in the textbook for this course is interchangeably used with a lithosphere, or the part of the planet that is defined by our rocks and soils. Uh, I have traditionally, and other textbooks have used geosphere as a catch-all term for our different spheres, the different components of our planet, that again capture each of our different abiotic and biotic components. The atmosphere looking at our air, the hydrosphere looking at our water, the lithosphere looking at our rocks, and the biosphere looking at that biotic component. So again, looking back at that first slide here, where ecology is defined by biotic and abiotic components, we talked a lot about the different biotic components in our biosphere, and we can break down our abiotic components into the air, water, and soil, or our atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. So let's talk about these components individually. The atmosphere is a sphere. It is the sphere that defines all gases on the planet. And they're divided by altitude, or distance above the Earth's surface. There are a couple of subsets of spheres present in the atmosphere. We have the homosphere, the part of the atmosphere, oops, sorry for the spelling there. The homosphere is the part of the atmosphere where all gases are well mixed, meaning that we have access to nitrogen and oxygen and trace amounts of greenhouse gases. The homosphere is a part of our troposphere. This is where all life is maintained, the part of the atmosphere. Oops. Again, I do apologize for my terrible handwriting. I do the best that I can, but such it is, my curse as an educator. The troposphere is the air that we breathe. So it's the part of the atmosphere that has the air that's functionally important to us. As mentioned before, the troposphere is defined by having 78% nitrogenous gas. Didn't mention this before, but our troposphere today is 21% oxygen gas. It wasn't always the case. Looking back in time, oxygen used to not be present in our atmosphere, but we've had photosynthetic organisms on this planet long enough to produce enough oxygen. Kind of weird to think about that every molecule of oxygen in the air was produced by something photosynthetic. And that leaves very trace or small amounts of our greenhouse gases. Now these trace amounts of greenhouse gases are kind of a catch-all term for the different things that can do a good job of trapping heat in our atmosphere. Things like carbon dioxide, things like methane, all important components of the air that we breathe. But important that we keep them at relatively low levels, simply because that would keep our planet from changing too rapidly and would maintain conditions similar to those in which humans evolved. After our troposphere, we have our hydrosphere, which is all of the water on the planet. And our hydrosphere has, again, a subset of a sphere that we call the cryosphere. This is all of the frozen water that's present on the planet. So when we study the component of the hydrosphere that traps that water in a non-usable form, the frozen water, it's important for maintaining our ocean levels, as well as important seasonally in different areas. And in terms of global climate change, we understand that our cryosphere is one of our most rapidly shrinking spheres. The amount of frozen water on the planet is rapidly decreasing because we are increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the air, therefore increasing the amount of temperature generally stored on the planet, and that temperature is going to warm up our frozen water. Now, our lithosphere is very important, very interesting. It is our sphere that is made up of our different soil and rock of the planet. It has 3 different layers: the crust, which is our surface, the mantle, which is the 84% of the rock underneath the crust, and between the core of the planet. The core is generally liquid rock because of the heat and pressure that drives it to be a viscous material. The mantle is now, if you look currently, it's a fairly rock-like or solid, but over geological time, the mantle behaves much more like a viscous liquid, thinking of a slow-moving, thick oil that moves underneath the crust and causes shifts in tectonic plates. The crust is the surface and is defined by having either oceanic crust or continental crust, and then different types of rock that make up that crust. These rocks can generally be formed via 3 different processes, 3 different categories. We have our igneous rock in the crust. This is perhaps what you've heard colloquially described as lava rock. This is where the lava or hot rock that's a liquid will cool and form a solid rock on the Earth's crust. We have sedimentary rock. This is rock that's formed by sediments compressing over long periods of time. Think sandstone as a good sedimentary rock in our crust. And last but not least, the metamorphic rock. These are rocks that can change or metamorphose based on heat and pressure. Our planet and our lithosphere also can be broken down into other spheres in that mantle, most notably the asthenosphere, and a layer between the surface crust and the asthenosphere, the lithosphere-asthenosphere boundary. That asthenosphere generally is defined as cooling rock and the part of the planet that behaves like a liquid over long periods of time, or a viscous liquid over long periods of time, and is driving the continental shifts. So I always like to point out the asthenosphere as the part of the lithosphere that's driving a lot of that movement that we'll see manifest as our continental shifts. And of course we have, last but not least, the biosphere, the thing that we've already talked about, the thing that we study with taxonomic hierarchies, the things that we study with community relationships, and the like. So now we'll take a hard pivot in the lecture and with a good understanding of our ecology and the background terms necessary to have a conversation about ecology, and instead focus on the impact of humans on the ecology. Because when talking about ecology and ecology going forward, very few organisms, living things, have had as much of an impact on our planet as humans. In fact, nothing has. When we want to talk about things that have had as much of an impact on our planet, we're going to be looking at asteroids, abiotic components that are hard reset buttons, or large changes in the environment, large changes to our atmosphere or hydrosphere or lithosphere. But instead, that change today is coming from a biotic component, us. So how long have humans been around on this planet, and how do we shape the planet? Well, humans have been around for something like 300,000 years, meaning that over the 4.6 billion years that the planet's been around, we're essentially a flash in the bucket, but some of our ancestors have been around from before then. So other hominid species like Homo neanderthalensis and Homo erectus, humans have existed on this planet for quite some time in various different forms. Now, most of that time, humans have actually existed as hunter-gatherers. And it is one of my perhaps pet peeves to say that when we existed as hunter-gatherers, we didn't have an ecological footprint. I've heard students repeat this, so I certainly try to address it in all my lecture content. We did have an impact on this planet. when we were hunter-gatherers. However, that impact was generally small. The impact was small because our population densities were low to moderate. However, there were some ways that we did shape our planet. We selected tree species for food. We know that where humans went, particularly more recently in the last 60,000 years, we saw species that we gathered for nuts become more prevalent in forests as humans perhaps removed species that didn't provide us food and instead propagated species that did. We exerted hunting pressure, changing some of the major megafauna that existed in different parts of the planet. And then, of course, something that is still performed today, controlled burns. To either clear for agricultural space, to clear out different species or change forest composition. These controlled burns have been performed by humans for long periods of time. So hunter-gatherers did have an ecological footprint. Humans have had an ecological footprint for a long time, but it's only recently that this footprint has exploded. The ecological footprint of humans has exploded in large part because of our population. We're now above 7 billion people. When looking through our distant past, in the last 10,000 years, 12 to 14,000 years, through the dawn of agriculture, we've seen massive increases in our overall population numbers. This overall increase in population has been coupled with an increase in overall carbon production. Overall emission rates have gone up drastically as our population numbers have gone up. So this graph here shows the amount of CO2 emissions and the amount of atmospheric CO2, meaning how much more CO2 is in the air. Even if it's a small fraction, we've close to doubled that fraction since the late 1800s, when our industrial revolution and fossil fuel mining began on a larger scale. Now, our ecological footprint, our changes to the carbon cycle, do give us both anxiety as well as a little bit of hope. And so I want to include this image from a paper that was published recently about sustainability that shows trends in global GDP, so how much economic development we're seeing in different countries, the material footprint, meaning how much stuff, trash, waste is produced in those countries, and how much CO2 is being produced, the fossil fuel emissions, via industrial processes, or FFI. Well, we've seen since the late 90s that before the late 90s, the carbon emissions, material footprints, and GDP were tightly linked, meaning that if we wanted to be economically better off, we needed to both do damage to the air and to our material footprint, which is not great, not very sustainable. But since the 90s, where we've had a bigger emphasis on renewable energies, we've been able to decouple or unpair our GDP and carbon emissions, meaning that we're getting gains in GDP without producing a 1-to-1 ratio of carbon emissions. So that's kind of cool once society has realized that CO2 is something that we want to control how much we're producing. We've done a good job of growing economically and improving human prosperity on this planet without doing an equivalent amount of damage to our air. However, the same hasn't been done for our material footprint. And this leads into the last topic that this course wants to emphasize: the impacts of poverty and affluence on the ecological footprints of humans. So, this image, again from the same paper, recycled from different groups, looks at how humans can maintain sustainable lifestyles on this planet. In societies that have too much poverty, we see that they are socially unstable. This can lead to wars and major strife for humans, and not a sustainable, not a consistent way of living. Most of human history has existed in this poverty trap, whereby resources are scarce, and when resources become too scarce, your neighbor's resources look really nice, and therefore you go invade your neighbor and cause massive strife and an ecological footprint there. A few things have quite a strong ecological footprint as war. Just ask the plants that lived on the fields of shelling that existed in World War I. So poverty doesn't have a strong social foundation. On the other side, once we've established a strong social foundation, political foundation, we can overconsume and be environmentally unsustainable. So the problem with affluence is that it is not ecologically sustainable, and the problem with poverty is that it's not socially sustainable. Poverty has problems with reaching overconsumption, so it's no overconsumption, because our ecological footprint in poverty is oftentimes much lower. You're performing manual labor, you're not traveling far, you're traveling by foot. That makes it more difficult for you to release more carbon than you are, release tremendous amounts more carbon than you would under a system of affluence. Now, that I shouldn't write no overconsumption here, but like unlikely overconsumption, because you don't have access to those technologies. But in order to alleviate that poverty, you are going to access energies that are not sustainable, like fossil fuels. So fossil fuels can help alleviate poverty. And because you are desperate to alleviate poverty, you're going to reach to the easiest resources and not care about the long-term sustainability, because you don't want to get into another war or another famine. And in this way, we borrow from past generations of carbon storage and cash in on those benefits of long-term savings, carbon savings, now. So poverty is unsustainable temporally over long periods of time, because you were going to try to benefit from previous work that's been done to store carbon. Affluence has the benefit of being able to access, has the ability to access clean energies. But as we all know, we don't take all of the benefits of affluence. We don't take all of our excess money and funnel it towards clean energy. We instead use it to overconsume, which is not great. The social stability that's granted here is much better, and we're able to invest in things like carbon capture or carbon sequestration and decarbonization of the grid or efficient ag. But overconsumption is also likely. When we look at the overall carbon footprints of poverty, we see that the bottom 10% of income earners on our planet are responsible for something like 3 to 5% of our overall material and carbon footprints. Whereas when we look at the top 10% of income earners in our planet, we see that they're responsible for something like 25 to 43% of our overall carbon footprint. So poverty, not something we want to stay in, but doesn't have a large footprint. Affluence, something that we all aim for, but our carbon footprint is much, much, much higher. So what can we do about this? How can we approach this issue of reducing carbon emissions as well as reducing our material footprint? Because as we see, we still haven't decoupled our material footprint from our improvements in affluence. Well, for that, we have to understand externalities. An externality is a byproduct of economic activity for which the party that's producing does not pay. So it's an abstract topic, but it's incredibly important. To understand this, let's take a look at when you buy gasoline. Currently, the price of gasoline is priced in a linear economy, whereby you pay the price of taking that gasoline from the ground and making it into gasoline. You pay that price in order to use it. You do not pay any of the price for the waste. The waste here is the carbon that's emitted into the atmosphere. You're not paying prices for recycling and reusing any of those other byproducts. So our linear economy that emphasizes taking, making, using, and wasting, that ends up in things in one bin, right? We take the fossil fuels in the ground and we pay to extract them and move them into this waste bin, does not capture the true externality of digging up fossil fuels. The economic theory that tries to do a better job of pricing externalities into our daily products is what's called a circular economy, whereby you pay both the price of taking and making, but also a reusing and recycling, so that way you are not borrowing from past or future generations, because we know that in the future, either climates will be different and our progeny will have to pay to live in those very different, non-sustainable or not human habitable climates, or they will have to pay the price of reusing, remaking, and recycling that we do today. Think of more of a junkyard planet, whereby resources are mined not from pristine nature, but rather from junkyards and reusing of our previous wasted resources. This circular economy tries to capture those externalities and therefore doing a better job of reducing our taking and making global material footprint. That idea of a circular economy is something that's been fairly popularized recently, sometimes referred to as the donut economy, helps us reduce what we call the tragedy of the commons. This is our last vocabulary term for this topic of ecology. The tragedy of the commons is an idea by which we have a shared resource that it will benefit you as an individual to take more from, but ultimately, if you take more from it, you will harm the long-term prospects of that common resource. It was first observed and written on paper by an English economist in the early 1800s, talking about a pasture. If every farmer in the area has a pasture that they graze their cattle, and they have a certain number of cattle that can graze on that pasture, they have a sustainable model whereby the pasture is able to regrow at a rate that the cows are able to consume it. But if you as a farmer say, hey, I would like a little bit more money, and you add a couple more cattle to it, perhaps that's not going to do too much over the short term, but more and more, those cattle will start to reduce the renewability of that resource. They'll take more than they're recycling and ultimately deplete that pasture. And now, whereas each farmer had a sustainable amount of cattle that they produced for milk and food each year from that pasture land, the temporary overconsumption, that temporary gain to you, caused the overall collapse of the ecosystem, and now the overall GDP of that ecosystem is zero. We see the tragedy of the commons play out time and time again in environments like fishing, and we're seeing it play out in our carbon sinks, as well as some of the waste byproducts. So I will, as I'm reaching the time limit for our talk, I want to again put a nice bow on everything here. We have a discussion, we visited the idea of externalities and how humans can do a better job of recycling things in order to have less of a material footprint. We looked over the dangers of both poverty and affluence, and how to understand how we can better decouple human affluence from our material footprint and our carbon emissions. We've discussed the different spheres that help us study our ecology and get a better understanding of our material footprint and carbon emissions. The lithosphere, the rock sphere, the hydrosphere, the water sphere, the atmosphere, the air sphere, all encapsulated under our geosphere. Then we talked about the biological hierarchy that describes how we study ecology. We talked about our taxonomic naming system, what defines a species. We talked about our different ecosystems. And then we talked most broadly about how we study ecology, the abiotic and the biotic forces that help us understand and conserve our planet.